The morning Henrietta Keating walked into the Shelby ranch and asked a man to marry her. She was wearing a dress 3 sizes too large, boots with holes in both soles, and the particular kind of dignity that only comes from a person who has absolutely nothing left to lose. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a working man's brow, necessary, persistent, and perpetually on the verge of being wiped away. The cattle drives had made some men rich and left others buried in sun-baked prairie dirt, and the town itself existed in that uneasy middle ground between civilization and wilderness that defined so much of the frontier in those years. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a livery stable, a small doctor's office, and the railroad depot that had arrived only 2 years prior and changed everything about how commerce moved through the region. Henrietta had arrived in Caldwell 8 months before that spring morning, accompanying her father, Earl Keating, who had come west with grand ideas about homesteading and cattle, and a future stitched together from frontier possibility. Earl Keating had been a dreamer in the most sincere and ultimately ruinous sense of the word. He had borrowed money from a man named Chester Holt, a land speculator who operated with the cheerful ruthlessness of a man who had never once questioned whether his methods were decent, and used that money to purchase 160 acres of grass and rock and hope. Earl had been 53 years old and Henrietta had been 22, and she had followed him because she had nowhere else to go. Her mother had passed of fever when Henrietta was 14. Her 2 brothers had gone north and east respectively, and neither had been heard from in years. When Earl had said, "Come west with me, girl, there's something real out there," she had packed what she owned into a single trunk and believed him. Earl Keating died of a chest infection in November of 1877, 4 months after they arrived. He died in the small cabin they had barely finished building, with Henrietta holding his hand and reading psalms by lamplight, and he died owing Chester Holt $420, which in 1878 was an amount that might as well have been the moon. Chester Holt came to collect in January. He arrived with 2 men who said nothing but stood very large in her doorway, and he told Henrietta with the tone of a man reading a dull inventory that she had 30 days to pay the debt or vacate the property, which he would reclaim as part of the lender's agreement her father had signed. Henrietta had read that agreement the night after her father died. She had read it 3 times. It was, as Chester Holt had described it, entirely legal, entirely cold, and entirely her problem. She spent 30 days trying to find a solution. She asked at the general store about work. She asked at the saloons, where she was looked at in ways she found humiliating and quickly refused. She had skills. She could sew, she could cook, she could read and write better than most men in Caldwell, but none of these skills translated into $420 in 30 days, or even in 30 months. She wrote to her brothers but had no addresses with any confidence behind them. She prayed with genuine sincerity and received no immediate financial response. What she received instead on the morning of the 29th day was the clear-eyed understanding that the only legal way to protect the land her father had died on was marriage, because a married woman's property, under the circumstances of the homestead agreement, could be reclassified under the husband's holdings in a way that would make Chester Holt's claim significantly more complicated to prosecute. Or so the town's only lawyer, a quiet man named Abraham Ford, had told her the week before. Abraham Ford had also told her, gently, that she would need to find a man willing to absorb the debt. Henrietta had spent the 29th day thinking about every man she knew in Caldwell. She thought about it with the practical, unsentimental rigor of a woman who understood that her survival was the question on the table, and romance was a luxury she could not currently afford. She made a list, mentally, and crossed names off one by one. The men she found genuinely decent were either already married or too old or too young. The men who were available were mostly available for reasons that made her uneasy. And then she thought of Jeremiah Shelby. Jeremiah Shelby was 28 years old and ran the second largest cattle ranch in the county, a property of 600 acres called the Double S, which sat 4 miles outside of Caldwell proper and represented 12 years of his unrelenting labor. He had come to Kansas at 16 with nothing but a strong back, a willingness to work before dawn, and a seriousness of character that people in Caldwell either deeply respected or found slightly unnerving, depending on who you asked. He was known for being fair with his workers, honest with his business dealings, and largely silent in social situations. He attended church on Sundays and did not drink excessively. He was not, by the standards of Caldwell's social arithmetic, an easy man to know. He kept himself at a particular distance from people that was not unfriendly exactly, but was deliberate in a way that made casual intimacy difficult. Henrietta had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in her 8 months in Caldwell, twice at the general store, once at a church social where he had stood near the wall eating a piece of dried apple cake with the focused attention of a man completing a task. Once when her father's wagon wheel had cracked on the road and Jeremiah had stopped his horse, climbed down without being asked, and helped Earl repair it with tools he had in his saddlebag, and then had ridden on without accepting thanks in any sustained way. She had noticed him. She had noticed that he was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that saw things clearly, and that his hands were the hands of a man who worked, and that when he had crouched beside the wagon wheel he had explained to her father precisely what was wrong and how to fix it, and then patiently waited while Earl, stubborn and proud, insisted on doing the actual repair himself. She had noticed that Jeremiah had let Earl have that dignity, and she had found it quietly remarkable. She had not, in any of those 12 encounters, imagined asking him to marry her. And yet there she was, on the morning of the 29th day, standing at the gate of the Double S Ranch in her oversized dress and her broken boots, looking at the modest but well-kept house beyond it, and understanding with the resigned clarity of a person out of options that this was what she was going to do. She opened the gate, she walked up the path, she knocked on the door. Jeremiah Shelby opened it in his work clothes, which meant trousers, suspenders, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and an expression of genuine surprise at finding Henrietta Keating on his porch at 7:30 in the morning. "Miss Keating," he said. "Mr. Shelby," she said. "I need to speak with you about something urgent, and I want to be completely honest with you from the first word, because you deserve that and I have nothing to hide." He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way she had noticed he did things, with full attention and no performance of it, and then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in then," he said. The inside of the house was clean and spare, with the particular character of a space maintained by one person for a long time. There was a fireplace with a good fire going, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, and a coffee pot on the stove that smelled like the best thing she had encountered in weeks. He poured her coffee without asking, which she appreciated more than she could say, and sat across from her at the table and folded his hands and waited. Henrietta told him everything. She told him about her father's debt and Chester Holt, and the 30 days and Abraham Ford's advice, and her failed attempts at finding another solution. She told him the exact dollar amount of the debt. She told him that she was asking him to consider marrying her as a legal arrangement, that she understood it was an enormous and frankly absurd thing to ask of a man she barely knew, that she was prepared to work hard and keep his house and cook his meals, and do whatever reasonable labor was required, and that she was not asking him for love or sentiment, only for the legal protection that marriage would provide. She said all of this in one mostly unbroken flow of words, looking at the table more than at him, and when she finished, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not read. The silence lasted long enough to be painful. "Miss Keating," he said finally, and his voice was even and careful, "if I agree to this, it won't be a temporary arrangement. Marriage in Caldwell is not something that gets undone easily, and I won't conduct my life as though it is." "I understand that," she said. "The debt," he said, $420, that's manageable." "I would find a way to pay you back," she said quickly. "I would keep track of every dollar." "That's not what I said," he interrupted, not unkindly. "I said it's manageable. I didn't say anything about being paid back." She looked at him. "I'll need a day," he said, "to think it through properly." "I have until tomorrow morning," she said. "Chester Holt comes at 10. Then I'll have an answer by tomorrow at 9, he said. He stood, which she understood as the end of the meeting, and she stood too, and he walked her to the door, and she stepped out into the spring morning and walked back down the path and through the gate and the 2 miles back toward her father's cabin. And the entire way home she was not entirely sure whether she had just saved herself or made the worst decision of her life. What Henrietta did not know, and what Jeremiah had been living with for months in the quiet and solitary interior of his own life, was that he had been in love with her since the day in October when he had stopped to help with her father's wagon wheel. It had not been a gradual thing, which was part of what made it difficult. He was not a man given to romanticism or easy feeling, and so when something broke through his habitual reserve, it tended to do so with the quiet, devastating thoroughness of water finding the one crack in a stone. He had crouched beside that wagon wheel, and Henrietta had handed him a wrench without being asked, anticipating what he needed before he reached for it, and she had done it with a natural, unself-conscious practicality that had done something unexpected to his chest. He had noticed her before that, had noticed her the way you notice something that is simply there, at the store, at church. A young woman with her father, brown hair, steady dark eyes, a particular way of holding herself that suggested she was paying careful attention to everything around her. But that morning with the wagon wheel had been different. She had talked to her father patiently while Earl fussed over the repair, and she had talked to Jeremiah briefly and sensibly about the road conditions, and she had thanked him at the end with a directness that assumed he was worth thanking, as though his help were real and not merely obligatory, and he had ridden away feeling something that he had not felt in a long time and had chosen not to examine too carefully because it seemed, under the circumstances of his life, like the beginning of a problem. He had watched her, over the following months, with the careful distance of a man who understood that watching was all he was going to do. He had asked about her father's health when he heard the old man was sick, and he had heard the news of Earl's death with a heaviness that went beyond simple neighborly concern. He had thought about calling on her to offer assistance, and he had not done it, because he understood that calling on a young widow, or effectively a young widow, though the title didn't quite fit since it was her father with his particular feelings in his chest, would have been a misuse of her vulnerability. So he had stayed away and told himself that was the decent thing and tried, without great success, to think about other things. And then she had knocked on his door and sat at his table and drunk his coffee and asked him to marry her, and Jeremiah Shelby had spent the entire conversation trying very hard not to let his face do anything that would frighten her or make the situation strange. He spent that day working, which was what he always did with difficult things, and working through the practicalities as he worked. The debt was real and manageable. The legal situation was as Abraham Ford had described. The arrangement Henrietta was proposing was, on the surface, a business agreement. She did not want sentiment. She had been very clear about that. But Jeremiah had spent enough time around cattle to know that the surface of a thing and the whole of a thing were rarely the same, and what he was considering was not a business agreement, no matter how neatly she had described it. He was considering a life. His life, which he had built with 12 years of hard work and which currently contained one person, namely himself, and which would contain Henrietta Keating if he said yes. He thought about what it would mean to live with someone he loved who did not love him, and whether that would be worse than not having her there at all. He thought about this for a long time. He decided, at some point in the late afternoon while mending a section of fence line, that the question was the wrong one. The right question was whether Henrietta Keating was going to lose her father's land and her home and her stability because no one stepped in to help her, and whether he, Jeremiah Shelby, was going to be the kind of man who let that happen when he could prevent it. The answer to that question was simple. He showed up at her cabin at 8:55 the following morning. She opened the door before he knocked, which told him she had been watching out the window, and the careful blankness of her expression told him she was frightened, though she would not have admitted it. "Yes," he said. She let out a breath that she had clearly been holding since yesterday morning. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very quiet and entirely sincere. "Chester Holt is coming at 10, he said. "We should go to Abraham Ford first." They were married 4 days later. Abraham Ford had persuaded Chester Holt, through a combination of legal argument and the veiled implication that contesting the marriage would be expensive and unpleasant, to accept the debt repayment over 6 months rather than in a single lump sum. Jeremiah had agreed to this without apparent difficulty. Holt had accepted it with the sulky compliance of a man who preferred easy money and had been denied it. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Thomas Carey in the small church with the leaning steeple. The witnesses were Martha Gaines, who ran the general store and had been Henrietta's only female friend in Caldwell, and Dade Cooper, Jeremiah's hired hand of 4 years, who shook Jeremiah's hand afterward with a warmth that suggested he found the development entirely unsurprising. Henrietta wore her best dress, which was pale green with cream buttons, and had her hair pinned neatly, and stood beside Jeremiah at the altar with her hands folded and her chin up. Jeremiah wore his good coat and his clean hat and stood with the particular stillness that was his natural mode of being, and when Reverend Carey said the words and asked if he took this woman, Jeremiah said, "I do," with a quiet certainty that Henrietta, busy controlling her own expression, did not have the attention to spare for analyzing. Afterward, Martha Gaines hugged Henrietta and whispered, "You've done better than you know, honey," which Henrietta took as the kindly encouragement it was intended to be and tried not to think too hard about. The first weeks at the Double S were, for Henrietta, a process of negotiation she had not fully anticipated. She had imagined in the abstract planning stage of her decision that the arrangement would be straightforward. She would keep the house, prepare meals, help where she was needed, and they would coexist as respectful strangers sharing a legal bond. She had not properly reckoned with the reality of Jeremiah Shelby as a present, breathing, quietly attentive person in her daily life. He was considerate in ways that made her feel slightly off balance. Not performatively considerate, not in the manner of a man trying to demonstrate his virtue, just consistently, practically, without fanfare. He had given her the larger of the 2 bedrooms without discussion and moved his own things to the smaller one. When she had, in those first days, worked until her hands were raw trying to establish her usefulness in a kitchen she didn't know, he had noticed, and the following morning had made coffee himself, and told her the household was not an emergency, that she could take time to learn where things were. When she had eventually found a rhythm in the kitchen that produced meals she was proud of, he ate them with a focused appreciation that was better than any extravagant compliment. He was also, she discovered, more interesting than she had expected. The shelf of books was not decorative. He had actually read them, and he had opinions about them that emerged in the evenings when they sat by the fire, and the silence between them occasionally opened into conversation. He had read 2 of Dickens's novels. He had a copy of Darwin's work that he had ordered from back east, and had thoughts about that were more nuanced than most of what Henrietta had heard on the subject. He had a quality of genuine curiosity that she found unexpectedly compelling. She also discovered that Dade Cooper was a permanent and cheerful fixture of ranch life, a man of 35 with red hair and a gap-toothed grin who had worked for Jeremiah since the beginning and treated the Double S as his own home, and who received Henrietta with a warmth that felt entirely genuine. There were 2 other ranch hands, Billy Marsh, who was 20 and barely spoke, and a Mexican man named Luis Vargas, who was 30 and had been with the ranch for 2 years and who treated Henrietta with a formal courtesy that she reciprocated with equal formality, until the day she attempted to make tamales for the first time and Luis, passing through the kitchen, witnessed the results with an expression of such politely concealed horror that they both burst out laughing and were afterward on much easier terms. The ranch itself was, she gradually understood, the product of enormous and careful work. Jeremiah had built it from almost nothing. The original structure, a 2-room cabin, was still visible in the bones of what was now a properly constructed house, and the pastures and fencing and water management represented years of labor that she could see in every practical detail. He had a small herd of 200 cattle that he was methodically growing, good grazing land, and a reputation along the trail for fair dealing that had him already in conversation with 2 drovers about contracts for the following season's drive. She began to understand, as spring moved into summer, that she was not simply surviving. She was living somewhere that functioned, that had purpose and order, and the particular satisfaction of work that produced visible results. What was harder to understand was Jeremiah. He was not distant with her, not in the way he was with most people in Caldwell, that habitual reserve she had observed at the church social and the general store. He spoke to her more than she had seen him speak to almost anyone, which she told herself was simply a function of proximity. He listened to her in the complete way that she had noticed from the beginning, and he asked her questions about her opinions and her father and her own past that were not intrusive but were genuine. He noticed things, her moods, her preferences, when she was tired, when something was worrying her, with a perceptiveness that she found simultaneously comforting and slightly unnerving. But he kept, with perfect consistency, to the terms of the arrangement as she had described it. He made no romantic overture of any kind. He never touched her except in the unavoidable casual ways of shared space. He never said anything that could be construed as crossing the line between practical partnership and something more. This was, Henrietta told herself firmly, exactly what she had asked for. It was correct. It was sensible. There was no reason for it to produce the occasional small ache of something she refused to name. The summer brought 2 things that changed the shape of their life significantly. The first was a drought that hit the region in late June and lingered through August, turning the grass brown and stressing the herd and requiring Jeremiah to make difficult decisions about water management and grazing rotation that he worked through each evening at the kitchen table, with maps and calculations spread before him. Henrietta had, without being asked, begun sitting at the table with him during these evenings, and had offered observations about the water survey map that he had received from the county office, observations that came from the fact that she had grown up watching her father manage a small farm in Missouri, and had absorbed more practical knowledge about land and water than she had realized, until she saw it being needed. Jeremiah had listened to her, seriously, and incorporated what she said into his thinking, and the experience of being listened to about something practical and important was one of the most quietly sustaining things Henrietta had felt in years. They managed the drought without catastrophic loss. 3 cattle died, and a section of the creek dried entirely and required rerouting, but by September, when the rain returned, the herd was intact and the pastures were recovering, and Jeremiah allowed himself one evening of visible relief, sitting on the porch in the cooling air with his coffee, and Henrietta sat beside him, and they were quiet together in the particular way they had developed, which was not absence of communication but a different kind of it. "You did well," she said. "We did," he said, and she felt the word land somewhere in her chest and tried to assess it calmly. The second thing that happened in the summer was Chester Holt. Chester had accepted the debt repayment arrangement with bad grace and had received the first 2 monthly payments with thin-lipped compliance. But in August, he arrived at the Double S unannounced with his 2 large silent men and informed Jeremiah. in the yard while Henrietta watched from the porch, that he had found what he believed to be a flaw in the homestead agreement's transfer of ownership, and intended to challenge the marriage's legal protection in the county court. Jeremiah listened to this without visible disturbance, thanked Holt for informing him, and told him that Abraham Ford would be in contact. Holt left with the air of a man who had expected more entertainment from the encounter and been cheated of it. What followed was 3 weeks of legal correspondence and 2 trips to the county seat, during which Henrietta read every document Abraham Ford sent and made notes in the margins, and during which Jeremiah conducted all of it with a calm effectiveness that reminded her of the way he had handled the drought, not by dramatic action, but by clear thinking and consistent work. In the end, the challenge was dismissed. The marriage was legally solid, the debt transfer was binding, and Chester Holt received a formal letter from the court that used the word frivolous, in a context that Henrietta found deeply satisfying. After they received the letter, Jeremiah came home from Abraham Ford's office and placed it on the kitchen table without ceremony and looked at her, and she laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and he smiled, which was something she had realized she did not see often enough and which had become, without her permission, one of her favorite things. "That's done then," she said. "That's done," he agreed. The summer moved into fall, and Henrietta found that her understanding of herself had shifted in ways she was still mapping. She was happy at the double S, not in the frantic, grasping way of a person who has been unhappy and is now clutching at relief, but in the settled, substantive way of a person who has found a life that fits. The work was real and she was good at it. The people around her were people she genuinely liked. The evenings were good. The mornings were good. The particular hour before anyone else was awake when she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a book and listened to the sounds of the ranch beginning to stir around her. And Jeremiah was a problem, not in any practical or dramatic sense. He had not done anything wrong. He continued to be, in every observable way, exactly what he had been from the beginning: decent, capable, attentive, real. The problem was Henrietta herself. The problem was that somewhere between the shelf of books and the drought maps, and the way he said, "we," about things, and the way he had let her father have dignity over a wagon wheel before she ever knew him properly, somewhere in all of that, she had made the mistake of falling in love with her own husband. She recognized it on a Tuesday evening in October, a year after her father had died, while she was washing dishes and Jeremiah was at the table behind her reading aloud a passage from a book about the geology of the Great Plains that he thought she would find interesting, and she was listening to his voice and the particular rhythm of his reading, and she turned to say something about the passage and found him already looking up at her with those brown eyes that saw things clearly, and the look lasted a moment too long. And Henrietta Keating turned back to her dishes with her heart doing something absolutely chaotic in her chest and understood, with the same clear-eyed certainty with which she had understood everything else terrible and unavoidable in her life, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She spent 2 weeks trying to manage it. She was, as she had always been, practical by nature and discipline. She reminded herself of the terms of the arrangement. She reminded herself that she had specifically said she was not asking for sentiment. She reminded herself that Jeremiah Shelby was a private man who had agreed to a legal partnership and had maintained it with impeccable correctness, and deserved not to have her feelings become his problem. She was, she told herself, an adult woman with agency and good sense. She would keep the feelings contained, and they would not intrude on the functional, mutually respectful life they had built. This plan lasted until the night of the first hard frost of November, when the temperature dropped with unexpected speed and Jeremiah came in from checking on the herd at 10 in the evening, cold to the bone, and she wrapped a blanket around his shoulders at the kitchen fire, and their hands touched, and neither of them moved away, and the silence that fell between them was different from any silence they had had before. "Henrietta," he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, something careful and undisguised. "Don't," she said quickly. He went still. "I mean," she started and stopped and tried to find the right words for something she had spent 2 weeks not saying. "I don't want you to say something kind because you've noticed that she stopped again. He was looking at her with complete attention, the blanket still around his shoulders, their hands still not quite touching. "Because you've noticed that you what?" he asked. She looked at him. She was tired of being sensible. "Because I don't want it to be kindness," she said. "If that's what it is, I'd rather rather things stay as they are than have you be kind about it." The pause was brief. "Henrietta," he said again, and this time his voice had no carefulness in it at all. "I have been in love with you since the day in October before you ever asked me anything. I have been managing it very carefully for a year and a half, and I would appreciate knowing whether that information is welcome." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard and the fire snapped. "Since before," she started. "Since the wagon wheel," he said. "You handed me a wrench without being asked." That's a very small thing," she said. "It wasn't," he said. "Not to me." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married out of desperation and come to love out of pure accumulation of who he actually was, and she felt something in her chest loosen and fall open in a way that was both terrifying and the most relieved she had felt in her life. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't," he said. "I didn't want to say anything that would make you feel obligated. The arrangement was yours and you had the right to keep it as you described it." "You let me believe it was only an arrangement," she said, "for a year and a half." "I did," he said. "That was," she said and paused. "That was very respectful of you, and it also makes me want to put you out in the frost." Something happened in his expression that she had never quite seen before, which was the full, unguarded version of the smile she had been catching glimpses of for months, and it was, she thought, devastating in the best possible way. "I'm sorry," he said, and he did not sound particularly sorry. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "That's what I was trying to tell you." "I've been trying not to tell you for 2 weeks." "I know," he said softly. "I've been watching you not tell me. You knew." "I suspected," he said. "I didn't want to assume." "You could have said something," she said. "So could you," he pointed out. She thought about arguing with this and decided that he was right, and that argument would waste time she did not want to waste. She reached up and took his face in both hands, which were warm from washing dishes and which she noticed were unsteady, and he turned his face slightly into her palm in the manner of a man who has been waiting a very long time for something and is not quite sure it is real. And she kissed him. Or he kissed her. The precise mechanics of who moved first were never something either of them could subsequently report with confidence. And it was quiet and unhurried and absolutely certain. The way things are when they have been true for a long time before anyone said them aloud. When they stopped, he kept his forehead against hers and she could feel him breathing. "Since October of '76, he said quietly. "When you handed me that wrench, that's how long." "That is an embarrassing amount of time to have kept that to yourself," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I'm very patient." "I've noticed," she said. She stayed where she was for a moment, in the warmth of the fire with the frost outside and his hands at her waist, and thought about the morning she had walked up his path in broken boots with nothing to offer but honesty, and what he had known when he opened the door, and the year and a half they had spent in this house building something that had turned out to be more than either of them had said it was. "We've been married for a year and a half," she said. "We have," he said. "And now we're actually married," she said. "We were always actually married," he said. "You know what I mean," she said. "I do," he said. "Yes, now we're actually married." They told no one anything because there was nothing to tell. From the outside, the double S looked exactly as it had. But Dade Cooper, who had known Jeremiah for 4 years and had been watching the whole situation with the patient attention of a man who was genuinely rooting for both parties, noticed within approximately 2 days that something had fundamentally changed, and went about his work with the smug satisfaction of a person who has been right about something for a long time. Martha Gaines at the general store noticed 2 weeks later, When Henrietta came in for supplies, and the careful self-containment she had carried since her father's death had been replaced by something that Martha had been hoping to see for a while. Martha hugged her and said nothing pointed, which was one of Martha's better qualities. Winter settled over the double S with the particular beauty of the Kansas plains in cold weather, when the sky went enormous and pale blue, and the grass bent silver in the wind and the world contracted to the warm radius of the fire and the work of keeping the animals through the season. Henrietta had, by this point, made herself genuinely indispensable to the ranch's operation in ways that went beyond the kitchen. She managed the supply accounts with a precision that immediately made the books more coherent. She had developed a facility with the horses that Luis Vargas had noted approvingly, and she had begun helping to plan the logistics of the spring cattle drive in a way that Jeremiah treated as entirely natural, which she found more affirming than praise would have been. They settled into the changed version of their life, with the ease of people who had already done the hard work of knowing each other before the softer parts arrived. There was a quality of comfort between them that could only exist because they had already been through the drought in Chester Holt and the long evenings with maps and the first frost and all the rest. They knew how the other worked. They knew when to talk and when to be quiet. They knew, by then, that the other was reliable in the particular ways that mattered. What was new was the rest of it. The hands that found each other across a table without either person looking, the quality of the evenings by the fire, the fact that Jeremiah had moved back into the larger bedroom, and they had put his bookshelf in there, and spent a Sunday afternoon rearranging things in a way that felt domestic and significant and pleasantly ordinary. The fact that she sometimes woke in the night to the sound of wind and felt him there, and went back to sleep immediately. The fact that he would sometimes stop in the middle of a workday, for no particular reason, and find a moment to come back to the house for coffee and stand in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and look at her, until she told him to either come in or go back to work, and he would come in always. January brought a piece of news that arrived in the form of a letter from back east. Henrietta had been writing, with some regularity, to various official addresses in the hope of tracking down her brother Robert, who had gone east before their father's illness, and whose last known address in Cincinnati had stopped producing responses 2 years prior. The letter was not from Robert. It was from a man who knew Robert, a business acquaintance who had found her father's old address in Robert's effects. Robert Keating had died the previous spring, of typhoid, and the acquaintance had felt she ought to know. He was sorry for her loss. Henrietta sat with this at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. She had not been close to Robert. He had been 11 years older and had left home when she was still a girl, and they had been strangers more than siblings by the time she came west. But the loss of the last thread of her family of origin was real, and she let herself feel it fully, which was something she had learned in this life was permitted. When Jeremiah came in for supper and found her at the table with the letter, he did not ask what had happened. He sat beside her, not across from her, and put his hand over hers on the table. "My brother Robert," she said. "He's gone last spring." "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know him well," she said. "But he was the last of them, my father, my mother, both brothers now." "You're not alone," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You have this house," he said. "You have this ranch. You have Dade and Louis and Billy and Martha Gaines. You have me." He paused, and there was something in the pause that was not entirely steady. "You have me, Henrietta, whatever else." She turned her hand over under his and held it. "I know," she said. "I know that." She grieved the loss in the way she had learned to grieve, which was to let it be real and then to let the reality of the present reassert itself. And the present was real and warm and good, and she was deeply grateful for it. Spring of 1879 came with the particular urgency of the cattle season, when the whole rhythm of the double S shifted into the preparation for the drive north. The spring cattle drive along the Kisham Trail was the financial fulcrum of the entire operation. A successful drive meant a good year. A failed one meant difficulty. And Jeremiah prepared for it with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. He had contracts with 2 Abilene buyers and a herd of 160 head ready for the drive. Henrietta had suggested, early in the planning, that she help coordinate the supply side of the drive: food, equipment, the management of what the drive crew would need for the 3 weeks on the trail. Jeremiah had agreed immediately, and without any of the faintly patronizing deliberation that she had half expected and had not received, which was one of the reasons she loved him. The drive itself she did not go on. That was not the custom, and the practicalities of a cattle drive made it genuinely difficult, and she stayed at the Double S with Billy Marsh, who had a bad leg from an old injury and stayed back to keep the remaining cattle and property. 3 weeks was a long time, longer than she had anticipated feeling, and she kept herself occupied with the accounts and the horses and a project she had been planning, which was the expansion of the kitchen garden into something substantial enough to provide real yield through the winter. She was in the garden on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of the drive's absence when she heard horses on the road, and she looked up, and it was Jeremiah coming home 2 days early with Dade and Lewis, and a face that was tired and trail dirty, and entirely the best thing she had seen in 3 weeks. And she stood up from the garden with her hands full of dirt and her hair untidy, and walked to meet him, and he climbed down from his horse and kissed her in the yard in front of Dade Cooper, who made a sound of profound satisfaction and led both horses to the stable with a studied nonchalance. "The drive went well," she said, against his shoulder. "The drive went very well," he said. 160 head, both contracts filled, good price, came back early. "I was done being away." "You were done being away," she repeated. 3 weeks is a long time," he said. "It is," she agreed. She pulled back and looked at him, trail dust and all, and felt the particular variety of happiness that is specific to having someone come home. The summer of 1879 was easier than the summer before. The drought did not return. The contracts for the fall market were strong. Chester Holt had sold his land operations to an investor from Kansas City and left Caldwell entirely, a development that the town received with collective relief. Dade Cooper had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, begun courting a widow named Clara Penn who lived in town and ran a modest boarding house, and the ranch's evening culture shifted slightly to accommodate Dade's newly complicated social schedule. Luis Vargas, who had been talking about returning to his family in southern Texas for 2 years, finally made the decision in August, and there was a proper send-off that involved Martha Gaines cooking and the Reverend and Dade making a speech that was more heartfelt than eloquent. And Lewis shook Jeremiah's hand for a long time and embraced Henrietta and told her, in the mixture of English and Spanish that was their habitual mode of communication, that she had made a good home of this place and that Mr. Shelby was a better man for having her in it. Henrietta accepted this with the full warmth it was intended to carry. They hired a new hand in September, a young man from Missouri named Cal Reeves who was 19, and reminded Henrietta slightly of herself at that age, competent and serious and determined to prove he could carry his weight. She helped him find his footing in the work and told him, when she caught him struggling with the accounts one evening, that she could show him how to read a ledger properly if he wanted, and the gratitude in his face was the kind that came from being offered something real. October of 1879 was when Henrietta first understood, in the specific and physical way that cannot be mistaken, that something had changed in the nature of her body's functioning. She waited 3 weeks before saying anything, which was not from uncertainty but from the desire to be sure. Then she told Jeremiah on a Sunday morning while they were still in bed with the early light coming through the window and the ranch slowly waking around them. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her with an expression that was so openly, unguardedly full of feeling that she felt her own eyes respond in kind, which she had not particularly anticipated. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've been tired, I'm fine." "We should send for Dr. Alderman," he said. "It's Sunday morning," she said. "Tomorrow morning then," he said. "Tomorrow morning is fine," she said. He put his hand carefully on her side, as though she had become something precious, and she laughed a little at his expression, and told him she had not changed from who she was, and he said he knew that. He just needed a moment, and she gave him the moment, and he used it to look at her in a way that was not entirely composed, which she found she did not mind at all. Dr. Alderman confirmed the pregnancy and gave Henrietta the same sensible guidance he gave everyone, which was to eat well, rest when she needed to, continue working if she felt able, and come to see him immediately if anything seemed wrong. Henrietta received this guidance with the practical appreciation she brought to useful information, and went home and continued running the Double S with the same competence she had developed over the previous year and a half. Jeremiah managed his concern for her with reasonable success. He did not become hovering in a way that would have frustrated her, but he paid attention in the careful way that was his nature and made sure there were always enough firewood and water, and that the heaviest work fell to other hands. He did not make a production of any of this. It was simply that when she reached for a heavy thing, there was often a hand already there. The winter of 1879 and into 1880 was a period of deep domestic satisfaction that Henrietta found herself examining with a kind of wondering gratitude. She had been so afraid, in those early weeks of the marriage, of being a burden, of having traded her independence for survival, and found herself diminished by it. What had happened instead was so different from that fear that she sometimes had to remind herself it was the same life. She was not diminished. She was more known, more anchored, more capable than she had been alone, not because Jeremiah had supplied something she lacked, but because the life they had built together had given her room to grow into things she hadn't known were in her. She told him this one evening in February, when the snow was deep outside and the fire was high and she was sitting with her feet up because her back was aching, and he was reading, and she said, with the directness that had always been her natural mode, "I want you to know that I'm glad I walked up your path that morning." He put his book down and looked at her. "Even though it was a terrible and desperate reason to knock on someone's door," she continued. "It wasn't terrible," he said. "I came to ask you to marry me for my father's land," she said. "That's fairly audacious by most measures." "You were honest about it," he said. "That's not terrible, that's just Henrietta." "Just Henrietta," she repeated. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment," he said. She looked at him in the firelight and thought about the wagon wheel and the wrench and everything after that, all the accumulation of days and decisions that had become this house and this fire and this man and the child growing in her and the life that was, against all reasonable expectation, exactly what she would have chosen if she had known how to choose it. "I know you do," she said. Their son was born on the 15th of March, 1880, in the bedroom of the Double S Ranch house, with Dr. Alderman and Martha Gaines in attendance. He was healthy and loud in his initial opinions and had a great deal of dark hair, and when Jeremiah held him for the first time, he sat in the chair beside the bed, with a careful wonder on his face that Henrietta watched from the pillow with a feeling that went beyond anything she had a word for. They named him Earl James Shelby, the first name for her father and the second for Jeremiah's father, who had died when Jeremiah was 12, and whose name he had not told her until she asked while they were discussing names in January. She had been quietly moved by the fact that he had kept that loss just as quietly as he kept everything important, and that he had offered the name without any indication that it cost him something. Dade Cooper met Earl James Shelby on the third day, holding him with the slightly panicked care of a man unused to small things, and declared him the finest-looking Shelby he had seen, which made Jeremiah raise an eyebrow and Henrietta laugh in a way that was still slightly painful and entirely worth it. Martha Gaines brought food for a week, which was the best thing anyone had done. Clara Penn, who was now formally engaged to Dade, came with her, and the four of them ate supper together in the kitchen, while Earl James slept in the cradle Jeremiah had made in February from good pine wood. And it was the kind of evening that becomes a memory you return to, warm and specific and irreplaceable. Spring deepened into summer, and Earl James Shelby grew with the determination of someone who had places to be, and the Double S expanded its operations to include a small additional pasture that Jeremiah had been planning for 2 years and now had the labor force, in the form of 2 new hands, to properly maintain. The cattle market in 1880 was favorable. The contracts were good. The books, which Henrietta managed with the precision she had always brought to them, showed a year that was building solidly on the years before it. On a warm evening in August, Henrietta put Earl James to sleep in his cradle and came out to the porch where Jeremiah was sitting, and she sat beside him and looked out at the pastures in the last evening light, the grass moving in a slow wind and the cattle settled for the night, and the whole sprawling, working, breathing life of the Double S around them. "My father would have liked this," she said. "What part?" Jeremiah asked. "All of it," she said. "This land, the work of it." He was a dreamer, but he knew what he wanted, and this is close to it. She paused. "He would have liked you." "I would have liked to know him better," Jeremiah said. "He would have tried to tell you how to fix things," she said. "You would have let him." "Probably," Jeremiah said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they watched the evening happen over the Double S and said nothing for a while, which was one of their best modes of communication. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was not a question he had asked her before, she realized. They had talked about so many things, but he had not asked that specifically. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, because Jeremiah's questions always deserved to be answered seriously. "Yes," she said, "completely. Are you?" "Since about October of 1876, he said, with brief intervals." She laughed. "That is a very long time to have been happy with brief intervals," she said. "The intervals were mostly when you weren't talking to me," he said. "You are," she said, "a much more sentimental man than you appear to be." "Don't tell anyone," he said. "Your secret is safe with me," she said. He kissed her hair and she closed her eyes in the warm evening air and felt the solidity of him beside her and the life around them. All of it built from that walk up the path in broken boots, all of it real. The autumn of 1880 brought a development that neither of them had anticipated quite so quickly. Henrietta found herself, in September, once again familiar with the particular morning exhaustion and the specific changes in her body's rhythms that had preceded Earl James. She told Jeremiah with less ceremony than the first time, because they were both better at this now, sitting at the breakfast table while Earl James, 6 months old and deeply interested in the world, reached for everything within arm's length. "Again," Jeremiah said. "Again," she confirmed. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and Earl James grabbed his father's thumb with a grip that was already impressive. And Jeremiah looked down at his son, and then up at Henrietta with an expression that was just happiness, clean and unambiguous, and she felt it reflected back in herself with the same simplicity. Dade Cooper and Clara Penn married in October, a quiet ceremony at the church with the leaning steeple which had been repaired that spring, finally, and now stood upright and somewhat proud. The wedding supper was at the Double S, because Henrietta's table was the best in the county by general consensus, and it was a good evening of food and warmth, and the kind of easy laughter that comes from people who know each other well and are glad to be in the same room. Cal Reeves had become, by this point, a genuinely valuable member of the ranch, and had also developed a cautious friendship with a girl in town, the schoolteacher's niece, which Henrietta encouraged with the carefully neutral enthusiasm of a person who is rooting for something and attempting not to show it too obviously. The winter of 1880 was mild, which was a mercy, and Earl James learned to sit up and then to pull himself to standing, and to make his intentions clear with a loudness that seemed disproportionate to his size. He was interested in everything and frightened of nothing, which Jeremiah observed with a mixture of pride, and what Henrietta suspected was mild alarm about the future. Their second child was born in April of 1881, A girl this time, delivered with the same matter-of-fact competence by Dr. Alderman and the same reliable presence of Martha Gaines. She had Henrietta's coloring and her father's steady brown eyes, and she was, from the first hour, a person with clear and firm opinions about how things should be done. They named her Rose Margaret Shelby. Earl James, 13 months old and a serious observer of his environment, examined his sister with the focused attention he had inherited from his father, and appeared to reach some private conclusion about her that he declined to share. That spring and into summer, the double S was 4 people in a household, and the rhythm of it was full and loud and warm. Jeremiah was a father with the same quality he was everything else: attentive, consistent, fully present in the way that some men were not, as though fatherhood were an obligation rather than a life. He had not had a father after 12, and Henrietta sometimes wondered, watching him with Earl James and Rose, whether he was aware of how carefully he was building for them what he had lost, or whether it simply came from him as naturally as the rest of his character. She asked him about it one night, with the directness that had always been her way. "Do you think about your own father when you're with them?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly I just think about them." "What do you think about them?" "Everything," he said. "What they'll need, what they'll figure out, what kind of people they'll be." He paused. "Earl's going to be trouble in about 3 years. "He's already trouble," she said. "Organized trouble," Jeremiah said. "That's different," she laughed. "And Rose?" "Rose is going to be fine," he said, with the certainty of a man who had recognized something in his daughter that he trusted. "She knows her own mind." "She does," Henrietta agreed. "She gets that from you," he said. "She does," Henrietta agreed again, without apology. He smiled at her in the firelight. She looked at him and thought, not for the first time, about the path and the mourning and the broken boots, and how the most pragmatic decision she had ever made in her life had turned out to be the truest thing she had ever done. The summer of 1881 was when Henrietta finally tracked down her other brother. Not Robert, who was gone, but Thomas, her youngest brother who had gone north, and about whom she had had no information for 4 years. A letter arrived in June through a chain of forwarding addresses and the persistent diligence of the postal system, and it was from Thomas Keating, who was living in Cheyenne, Wyoming, working as a farrier, and who had found her through a combination of her old Missouri address and the forwarding directions she had left with the Caldwell postmaster when she came west. Thomas was 32. He had a wife named Sarah and a boy of 4 named James. He had not known about their father's death until a traveling acquaintance mentioned having passed through Caldwell and hearing the name Keating. He wrote with the awkwardness of a man who has been absent too long and is not sure what he is owed or what he owes, but underneath the awkwardness was something genuine. Henrietta showed the letter to Jeremiah, and he read it in his careful way and said, "Write back." "I don't know what to say to him," she said. We were never particularly close. He left when I was 15, and I've had 1 letter in 17 years. "Write back anyway," Jeremiah said. "You don't have to know everything you want to say, just start." She wrote back. Thomas replied. They began a correspondence that was slow at first and then, as the awkwardness wore off, became something more comfortable. He came to visit in the fall, just Thomas, traveling alone from Cheyenne, and he arrived at the double S rail-thin and weather-beaten, and with the careful eyes of a man who has been through some things he has not told anyone, and he stood in the yard and looked at the ranch and then at Henrietta and said, "I'm sorry I was gone so long." "I know," she said. She introduced him to Jeremiah, and Thomas shook his hand and looked at him in the appraising way of a brother. A function he had not had the opportunity to perform and was performing slightly late, and Jeremiah met his gaze steadily with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to justify. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned to examine Earl James with the bewildered delight of a man who had not known he had a nephew. Thomas stayed for a week. He and Jeremiah talked in the evenings about farrier work and cattle and the land north in Wyoming, and Henrietta watched her husband extend the same careful, genuine interest to her brother that he extended to everything he thought was worth knowing about. And she loved him, in those evenings, in a very specific and particular way that was about exactly that quality in him. The way he never performed engagement but was simply, actually, present for it. When Thomas left, he took with him a standing invitation to bring Sarah and the boy south in the spring, and he left Henrietta with the particular feeling of a debt partially paid, not a debt between them specifically, but the larger debt that life occasionally creates between people who have been apart and find their way back. The years on the double S moved with the rhythm of the land and the seasons and the work, and time did not so much pass as accumulate, each year adding to the structure of the life rather than simply replacing what came before. The cattle operation grew. The house was expanded in 1882 with a proper second bedroom for the children and a larger kitchen that Henrietta had been planning for 2 years. Cal Reeves married his schoolteacher's niece, a cheerful young woman named Agnes, and eventually they built their own small place on the edge of the double S property that Jeremiah sold them at the kind of price that was more generosity than business. Earl James Shelby at 3 was, as his father had predicted, organized trouble of the most comprehensive variety. He had opinions about everything and the physical confidence of a child raised in open space, and he followed Jeremiah around the ranch with a determined commitment to being wherever the interesting work was happening. Jeremiah taught him, at 3, how to hold a rope, and at 4 how to brush a horse, and did both with the patience of a man who has been patient his whole life and finds it not a burden but simply how he works. Rose, at 2 and then 3, was a different kind of presence, quieter in her movements but no less determined, with her mother's directness and something of her father's capacity for stillness that meant when she wanted to know something, she simply looked at you until you explained it. She had a particular fondness for her father that expressed itself as a tendency to locate him in whatever part of the ranch he was working in and station herself nearby, not demanding attention, just present, and Jeremiah accepted this with the completeness with which he accepted everything about both his children. Henrietta's life in those years was full in a way she had not known to want before she had it. She ran the household and the accounts, which now extended to a modest but functional set of books for the ranch operations. She maintained the garden with the ambition it deserved, and the yield was enough to keep them through winter with surplus for trading. She continued her correspondence with Thomas and twice yearly with Martha Gaines's sister in Lawrence. She read voraciously, working through Jeremiah's shelf and the books she ordered herself and the occasional lending from Dr. Alderman, who had a fine collection of medical and philosophical texts. She was not bored. She had never been bored in her life, but she had been afraid once of being diminished, and instead she was more herself than she had ever been. In the spring of 1883, Jeremiah came home from a trip to Abilene for the cattle contracts with a look on his face that she had learned to identify as containing something significant that he was organizing before he said it. She let him have supper first. Afterward, when the children were in bed and the evening was quiet, he said, "I heard something in Abilene about the land north of us, the Mac Allister property. Henry Mac Allister's place," she said. "He's been talking about selling for 2 years. "He's selling," Jeremiah said. 300 acres, good water source on the northern edge. She looked at him. "That would double us," she said. "Nearly," he said. "The price is significant." "How significant?" he told her. She did the calculation in her head, which she could do quickly now after years of managing the numbers. "We could do it," she said. "Not easily, but we could." "I think so too," he said. "I wanted you to look at the numbers before I said yes to anything." She got the ledger. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table, the same 2 chairs where she had drunk coffee and asked him to save her 5 years ago, and went through it with the same partnership they brought to everything, and by the end of the evening they had a plan. The Mac Allister purchase was completed in May of 1883, and the Double S became a 900-acre operation that required 2 additional hired hands and a significant expansion of their fencing infrastructure, and gave Jeremiah, in the spring of 1884, the capacity to negotiate cattle contracts that made the ranch genuinely substantial by the standards of the county. He told her the evening the first major contract under the expanded operation was signed that he had not imagined this when he started. He said it with a matter-of-factness that was entirely characteristic, sitting on the porch in the evening light with his coffee. "When you started?" she asked. "When I was 16 and had nothing," he said. "I thought the best I could build was enough to be independent. I didn't think about this." "What do you think about it now?" she said. He looked out at the land in the evening, the pastures and the new fencing and the cattle settled for the night, and the house behind them with the children asleep in it. "I think it's more than I built," he said. "We built it. You were here first," she said. "You made it worth building more," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That is, again, more sentimental than your reputation suggests." "You know my reputation better than anyone," he said. "I do," she said, "and I know the reality better than that." He held out his hand without looking at her, and she took it, and they sat in the evening with the Double S around them, and the stars beginning over Kansas and the years of it all, the wagon wheel and the broken boots and the frost and the coffee and the children and the arguments they had had and resolved, and the losses they had carried, and the table and the fire and all of it. Everything they had accumulated from that one pragmatic, desperate, honest morning that had turned out to be the beginning of everything. Thomas and Sarah and their boy James visited that summer, and Sarah Keating was a small, sharp-eyed woman from Wyoming who got along with Henrietta with the directness of 2 people who have both built their lives with their own hands and understand that about each other. Thomas had filled out from the rail-thin man of 2 years before and had the settled look of someone who had found his ground. Their boy James and Earl James Shelby were the same age, 4, and spent the week creating a small domestic crisis in the chicken yard that required adult intervention 3 separate times. On the last evening of the visit, when the children were asleep and the 4 adults were on the porch, Thomas said, "I should have come back sooner. I should have found you sooner." "You found me," Henrietta said. "Father died and I wasn't here," he said. "I wasn't here for Mother," she said. "I was 14 and there was nothing I could do, but I wasn't old enough to do anything. And you were young and you left. People leave, Thomas. It doesn't have to mean everything." He was quiet. "You're here now," she said. "That's what counts." Jeremiah said nothing, but she felt him listening in the way he always listened to things that mattered, and she knew he would remember this conversation the way he remembered things whole, with the texture of it intact. After Thomas and Sarah left, she and Jeremiah sat on the porch for a while longer, and he said, "You were kind to him." "He's my brother," she said. "You were kind to him when you didn't have to be," he said. "When he had been absent long enough that you would have had every right to be harder about it." "Life is hard enough," she said. "I don't need to add to it." He looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just you." "Me," she said. "Just you," he said. And the way he said it made the simple phrase carry everything he had ever meant by it, which was considerable. In the fall of 1884, Henrietta was 30 years old and found herself expecting their 3rd child, which she received with the equanimity of experience, and Jeremiah received with what she described as a highly suspicious amount of composure that she suspected was covering a great deal of emotion. "You're pleased," she said. "I am," he said. "More than you're showing," she said. "Probably," he said. Their 3rd child was born in February of 1885, a boy, during a snowstorm that confined them to the house and required Dr. Alderman to arrive through 2 feet of snow with the dedication of a man who understood his purpose. He was a robust and opinionated baby who arrived with a clear sense of his own importance and was named Samuel Thomas Shelby, Samuel for no one in particular, Thomas for Henrietta's brother, who was notified by letter and wrote back with a warmth that had none of the awkwardness of earlier years. Earl James, 4, inspected his new brother with the seriousness of a born older sibling and declared him acceptable. Rose, 3, appointed herself Samuel's personal authority on all matters, and took this responsibility with the gravity it deserved. Jeremiah held Samuel the night after he was born, in the chair by the bed where Earl James had been held 5 years before, and looked at his son with the same careful wonder, and then looked at Henrietta with something beyond it, something cumulative, all the years of it looking out of him at once, and she reached up and touched his face, and he turned his hand to hold hers against his cheek. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Yes, more than all right." "Good," she said. "Because we now have 3. "I know," he said, and his voice had a quality of quiet, complete, undefended happiness that she had come to know as the truest thing about him. The double S in 1885 was a living, working, full household, 3 children, a husband, a household that Henrietta ran with the efficient precision of a woman who had never wasted a minute on what was unnecessary, and had found room in that precision for everything that mattered. The ranch hands came and went over the years, though Dade Cooper remained a constant presence even after he and Clara established their own household in town, appearing at the ranch 3 days a week with the comfortable ownership of someone who has been there from the beginning. Cal Reeves and Agnes had a daughter, and Agnes and Henrietta had become the kind of friends who know each other's business without requiring explanation. Martha Gaines retired the general store in 1886 to her nephew, and moved to Lawrence to live with her sister, which produced a leave-taking that Henrietta found more emotional than she anticipated, hugging Martha in front of the store while Earl James and Rose watched with the solemn attention of children witnessing an important adult ceremony. Martha held Henrietta at arm's length at the end and said, "You came here with nothing but backbone, and you built a whole life." Your father would burst with pride, and Henrietta accepted that fully and felt it go deep. The years were generous, the ranch prospered, the children grew. Earl James at 8 was exactly as advertised, clever, physical, always in motion, with his father's seriousness living alongside an energy that Jeremiah managed with a patience that continued to impress her. Rose at 7 was reading 2 years above her age, and had the unsettling quality of listening to adult conversations, and then asking questions that revealed she had understood everything perfectly. Samuel at 3 was simply and completely himself, a round-cheeked, cheerful presence who loved horses above all other things, and was already trying to sit on the fence to watch them, with an ambition that required constant supervision. Henrietta at 32 had the life she had not known to imagine. She had a husband she loved with the deep, specific love of a person who knows someone all the way through and has found that knowledge to be entirely good. She had children who were real and present and hers. She had a ranch that she had helped build from debt and crisis into something substantial and true. She had the land her father had dreamed of, expanded far beyond his dream, maintained with the kind of care that honored the fact that he had brought her west to believe in something. On an evening in the late spring of 1887, when the double S was 10 years old as Jeremiah's property and 4 years old as theirs together in the full sense, they sat on the porch after the children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet under a sky that was enormous and starthic and entirely itself. Henrietta had been thinking all day about the morning she had walked up this path. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about a thing that has become a story you know well, with the specific texture of it, the broken boots and the coffee, and the particular quality of Jeremiah's silence when he listened to her explain the terms of her own desperation. "What were you thinking?" she said. "When I walked up the path that morning." He turned to look at her. "Be specific," he said. "When I knocked on the door," she said. "Before you opened it, what were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know it was you," he said. "I was thinking it was Dade because he sometimes came early. Then I opened the door. And then," she said, "and then I was thinking several things at once," he said. "That you were the last person I expected. That you looked like you hadn't slept. That whatever had brought you to my door at 7:30 in the morning was serious." He paused. and that you were there, which was something I had wanted to be true for a long time in ways I had been managing. Managing, she said. Managing very carefully, he said. And then I asked you to marry me, she said. And then you asked me to marry you, he said. What did you feel, she said. He looked at her steadily in the evening light, this man she had known for more than 10 years and loved for nearly that long, and he said, with the simple directness he had learned from her and the honesty that had always been his own, like the thing I had been afraid wasn't possible might be. She looked at him. That's a complicated feeling, she said. It was a complicated morning, he said. I came to ask you for a legal arrangement and a debt absorption, she said. I know what you came for, he said. And you said yes anyway, she said. I would have said yes to anything, he said. That's the truth of it. I would have said yes to whatever terms you put forward as long as the outcome was that you didn't lose your father's land and you were here. He paused. I needed you to be all right. That was the first thing. You could have told me that, she said. You weren't ready to hear it, he said. She thought about this. The 22-year-old Henrietta in the broken boots, practical and frightened and determined, who had come to the double S with a proposition and nothing else. Would she have heard it? Would she have known what to do with the information that the man sitting across from her at the table had loved her since October? No, she said honestly, I don't think I was. I know, he said, so I waited. 1.5 years, she said. It wasn't difficult, he said. You were here. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His hand was large and calloused and completely known to her, every scar on it, every line of it, and she held it the way you hold something that is yours in the deepest and most irreversible sense. I'm glad you waited, she said, and I'm glad I was too stubborn to keep not saying it. First hard frost, he said. First hard frost, she agreed. Very romantic. I thought so, he said. She laughed. The evening sat around them, warm and real, and the stars moved over Kansas in the slow way they always had, indifferent to the small bright fact of the people below them. And the double S breathed and settled around its fences and its pastures and its cattle and its 3 sleeping children and its house with the good fire banked for the night. And Henrietta Keating Shelby held her husband's hand in the dark and felt the full, unambiguous, deeply earned weight of a life that was, in all the ways that counted, everything she had ever needed it to be. She had walked up the path with nothing but a proposition. She had not known, when she knocked on that door in her broken boots, that she was knocking on the life she was supposed to have. She had not known that the man who opened it had already loved her through an entire autumn and a winter and into spring, quietly and without assumption, with the patient certainty of someone who understood that some things were real whether or not they were spoken. She knew it now. She had known it since the first hard frost of November, since the moment in the kitchen with the blanket and the fire, since he had said since October of '76 in a voice that had nothing careful in it at all. The double S stood on the Kansas prairie in the long spring evening, solid and real, the product of 12 years of one man's labor and 4 years of 2 people's partnership, and the kind of love that is built the same way a ranch is built, not in a single grand gesture, but in the accumulation of daily choices to show up, to stay, to do the work, to be present for the life in front of you. Jeremiah's hand tightened around hers. All right, he asked. More than all right, she said. Above them the sky went dark and enormous, and the stars came fully into their own, and the night settled over the double S with the same permanence it had always settled over the land. And inside the house, Earl James and Rose and Samuel slept the deep sleep of children who have never had to worry about whether they were safe, because the 2 people on the porch had built something specifically so that they never would. It was, Henrietta thought, with the particular gratitude of a person who has known what it is to have nothing, about as good as a life could be. And in the morning she would get up and make coffee and sit at the kitchen table in the early quiet before anyone else was awake, and Jeremiah would come down and stand in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, and she would look at him and he would look at her, and the day would begin the way all their days began now, with the simple, certain knowledge that they were exactly where they were supposed to be together. in the life they had built from one honest morning and a question she had been desperate enough to ask, and he had been ready, since long before she asked it, to answer yes.